Hi, I'm Ruth from Connect Group in Birmingham, and I'm one of the lead developers, and I do Java development. And I work on a team that we do projects for Jaguar Land Rover. We do their main websites, we do the finance calculator, and we do the configurator, where you can choose the different models of cars and the different options. And I live in Shrewsbury with my wife Sonia. I'm trans. I always say that just because I'm very keen on diversity and getting awareness out there, especially with what's going on in America, in North Carolina, where people aren't allowed to use the bathroom and things like that. And I'm a massive Doctor Who and Star Wars fan. My bathroom door looks like the TARDIS. And I'm also a massive Raspberry Pi geek, so I've got Raspberry Pis all over the house playing music and video, that sort of thing. So the talk tonight is on TDD, test-driven development. It's something that we're very keen on at Connect, on our Agile teams, and there's lots of reasons why we do it. The first thing is we're really keen on clean code, so that's making your code as clean and logical as possible, avoiding repetition. And the good thing about TDD is that you think about what you're about to code before you actually go and code it. We also do a lot of BDD, where we get user stories from business analysts, and they write things down in terms of given, when, and then. So by using the BDD language, that can then give us a starting point for the tests that we write to make sure that our code is meeting those requirements that we need to for the user stories. And also it's a good way of reducing bugs in the code and improving quality. And that's especially the case when you're refactoring, sort of moving things around, or a new requirement comes in and you've got to change stuff, fix a bug. If you've got that test coverage, you can just run your unit test suite, and then if you see tests starting to fail, you know that something needs looking at. And obviously, it catches as many issues as possible while you're developing and at build time, before that code goes out of the door and goes on the live website. So the process itself, it's quite straightforward. The idea is that you do it iteratively. So the first thing you do is write the simplest test, to test the simplest bit of logic that you can code. You run that test, and it should fail because you've not written the code that you're testing for. So you write the code, and then when you run the test, it should pass. And if you've got an IDE like Eclipse or IntelliJ, you should see that you get a green bar when you run the tests. I'll be coming on to that, I'll be doing some examples of that soon. And it's always a good idea periodically to refactor the code, so you can tidy the code up. And then once you've refactored, you run all the tests again and make sure that all your tests still pass. And then you repeat the process, adding a test and then another bit of code, and then making sure that test passes and so on. And the way we like to write our JUnit tests is that we like to have very self-explanatory method names in plain English. So it's often, should do something when some condition is met. And that also ties in with the way that we use BDD. Some people might have come across Cucumber or Fitness that you can also use to generate your test names. And obviously each test should be as simple as possible. Ideally with just one assert, just testing one thing. So an example of that, might be assert that some value from your test is equal to what you're expecting. And we use JUnit. Anybody use JUnit here? Cool, quite a few people then. And so typically it's just set up your class to test any dependencies, execute the method, and just check for an expected result or an exception. The assertion framework that we use is called Hamcrest, which it's an anagram of matches, and that just makes it easier to see what the assertion is. It's nicer than just using assert true or assert false or whatever. And as well as Java, you can get it for Python and all sorts of other languages as well. So some of the matches that you might have, it just might be equal to, just checking for a value. You've got the not, and you've got other booleans for testing Boolean logic. You've got null, not null. If you're checking that you've got a list that's got an expected size, you can use has size, and so on. So So I'm going to jump straight into a code example. It's a bit of a straightforward one. It's like a game called FizzBuzz that I think is used for like teaching kids division at school, but it's just a nice, straightforward example to show the process. Is that screen okay, or is it a bit too small?
Too small.
I'll just see if I can change the resolution so we can see what we're doing better. Otherwise you can't see the code, let's see. I'll switch it to 720p, that'll work. Oh, that's loads better. So I've got my test. I've just set things up so I've got the simplest possible test, which is to test this class, which just returns null at the moment because I haven't coded it yet. And I can just run this as JUnit. Test class. And obviously it fails because it's returning null. Now if I'm doing like the very strict TDD, I'd just do the simplest thing possible to make it pass the test. So I could even just like make it return 1, which is nonsense because it should actually return the number itself. But if I do that, it passes that test. So the next test I could write is, okay, we pass in 2. And we should expect to see 2 returned. So I've got my assertion. So run that, that fails. So I can just change that now to return string value of that number. And that passes that test. So for the third one, I want it to return fizz if it's 3. So run that and that fails. So I can change that and say if simplest thing is if the number's equal to 3. Otherwise return the number. That passes. The next test I would do is it should return buzz when you pass in 5. That fails, so I can put another else if. So the next test I do is test 6, because that's like the next multiple of 3. So that should be fizz as well. But that's failing because I was too simplistic with saying if number is equal to 3. But if I change that to %3 equals 0, then it's divisible by 3. That'll pass. I can do the same for passing 10 in for buzz. So that fails, but so I can change that again. Rerun it. So the first number that should be 15 would be, 15 would give you fizzbuzz. And this is where, if somebody had got the logic wrong, they might have put else if the number is divisible by 15 there, then return. But if you run that, that is still going to fail because it's hitting divisible by 3 first. So if I change that so that was the 15 first. And if I rerun that, then that's showing that everything still passes. So that's probably the simplest example of TDD that you can do, kind of. But it just like shows the process. Anybody used the locking framework? Also quite a few people are used to the locking framework. So that's used where you've got things like databases or web services that your code is calling, but you want to test your code as a unit test in isolation, so you don't have to fire up a database every time, or be connected to the internet or have that web service up and running to be able to test your code while you're developing. So instead of that, you can mock the code that you're calling using a mocking framework such as we use Mockito. You can even, in Java, just like write your own mocks where you can like override methods to mock what you're expecting, but we use Mockito. And so that's also good because you can also test like exceptional conditions that you might not normally get, such as like database errors or web services being down and so on. And that's also good because you can run all your unit tests standalone without needing a database or the internet, which if you're doing like continuous integration where you're like running a Jenkins build, that'll mean that your tests will run faster and you won't have the situation where your tests are failing because the web service is down. So like I said, we've got Mockito for Java. You can also get JS Mockito for JavaScript. And it's literally just a question of using the static keyword mock, static method mock, and just passing in the class name. And then when you've got the mock, you can tell what you want to happen, so you can either get it to return an object or throw an exception, for example. And then you just inject the mock into the object that you're testing instead of the real thing, if you're using something like Spring where you've got dependency injection. So I've got a very Mickey Mouse example of how to use Mockito to mock a web service. Because it's May the 4th, Star Wars Day, I'll show you the code. If the web service is down and you get the exception, then we want it to return these are not the films you're looking for. So I run this test, and I'm being a bit naughty because I've actually written both tests before coding anything. And that's just like for speed. So I can go to my actual Java class that I'm testing. So at the moment the getFilms method is just returning null. So I could wrap that in a try block, catch the not found exception, and return that expected error message. And then when I go back to run the tests, then I've no rate exception. Oh, there it is. It's a. What's that? Oh, I know what I've done. I haven't called the web service. So I call the getFilms method because it was complaining that I wasn't throwing that exception, but I am now, so that's cool. So if we run that, then that's past the test that's expecting the error message. And then the next test, it's expecting the list of films in the right order, kind of separated. So I could just go through that list. So get me list of films. So we're going to pen the name of the film. The comma. So I can run that test, and it's failing. And the reason that it's giving is that it's got the extra comma on the end, which it doesn't want for the last film. So if I fix the code, I can just say if I is less than films.size -1, and it'll only put the comma on if it's not the last film. So I can rerun that, and it all passes then. I mean, if it was going to be even stricter, I'd just do a test where it returns no films, and then returns 1 film, and then 2 films, and so on, just to like make sure you get a blank string with no comma. If there's no films, you just get a single film with no comma if it's 1 film. But I've just skipped that for brevity, because we'll be here all night otherwise. And like I mentioned before, it's always a good idea to, you can refactor the tests as well. So, for example, in the films test, there's a private method for getting the list of films. So if you've got tests where you need the same data for more than one test, it's best to put that in like a private method, or make use of your before annotation. So the setup method, that gets run before every test. Just make sure you've got your dependency set up. And again, I haven't done this, but if you've got like a constant, like these are not the films you were looking for, it's best to put that in a static constant at the top. For example. So it's just like making sure your code is as tidy as possible for your tests as well as the code itself. Now, something we do at Connect, which I think is fairly unique to us, is that we actually test the data bindings between, like you've got your Spring MVC with your model and view, and you've got your front-end HTML, because we use a framework called Thymeleaf, which is it's a Java View template engine. Anybody come across Thymeleaf? Or not? The good thing about that is, unlike JSP, it's got a TDD framework, so you can like test to make sure that, suppose you've got like a title on the web page, you're replacing some placeholder text that's being put in by a front-end developer with the actual that text from the application. So for example, we might want to replace the H2 tag with Jaguar, if it's like on the Jaguar website. We've got our own set of Hamcrest matches for doing that as well. So we can like check if an element exists in the HTML DOM, if it's got a particular attribute, if it's got child elements, if it's only got text, if it's a single element, and so on. So that uses like CSS3 selectors to interrogate the HTML that's been produced after the Thymeleaf engine has replaced the text on that page. So I've got a Mickey Mouse demo of how we do that. So it's a Star Wars example with Darth Vader. And what we've got for that is, should be in source main resources. We've got templates, Thymeleaf example, it's literally just an HTML page where you've got an image of Darth Vader and an H1 title with the text. And the tests for that so we've got like some boilerplate stuff for setting up the Spring framework for doing that, tells it the path to the HTML file. And what we want to do is to make sure that we're replacing the image with the image from the model in view. So we've got, I'll show you the controller class we've got for that as well. So if this works, we should see Darth Vader to be replaced with Yoda, and I find your lack of faith disturbing should be replaced with do or do not, there is no try, if this works. So if I run the tests for the Thymeleaf, then both tests are failing. And it's saying it's expecting expected image, but it's actually getting Darth Vader. And it's expecting the expected quote, but it's getting I find you lack of faith disturbing. So what if I go to the HTML and I add data th source is equal to the image from the controller, and I can rerun the test, then that's now passing the test for the image. So if I refresh, I've got Yoda, but I've still got the Vader quote. So what I can do for the H1, I can put in data th text equals the quote. Being on the test, they both pass. And if I refresh, I've got the Yoda quote. But this is really useful because on the Agile teams we've got to connect. We tend to have people that just do the back-end Java and other people that just do like the front-end HTML, CSS, etc. So they produce like, because it's a component-based site, so we've got like different components on the page. So they might produce the HTML from components and mock it up nicely with some test data. But then we want to replace that with the actual data from the content management system. And this is a way of doing it, so we don't actually modify the look of their HTML, but when we run it on the server, we get the actual data from the CMS put in place of the placeholder text. So that was just like a brief example of that. Quite a nice way of doing it. And we also use the Mocha framework for front-end JS testing. Anybody use Mocha here? A couple of people use Mocha, cool. And that is kind of similar to like JUnit and Hamcrest. So you've got Mocha for your, that would be like similar to JUnit, and then the Chai assertion framework, that would be like Hamcrest. And I've just got a quick example of like the FizzBuzz in JS. It's nice that you get like a web page that gives you a list of your tests and if they passed it or not. So I'll just do a couple of those. So I'll be able to do my static. So it's got like the simplest test. It should return 1 once the flag. That's already set up to just return the number. If I just make it return empty string and rerun it, then that fails, and you can see it's saying why it's failed. So I'll put the tests in for 2, I know the one for 2 will pass already. Should return 3, no, should return Fizz. put that test in, that fails. And I modify the JS. And then that passes and so on, so it'd be like the same as the Java example if I carried on doing that. But it just shows that you can use TDD on the front end and on the back end as well. And another thing that we're quite keen on is making sure we get quite a high code coverage. And that is like where you can run the tool to make sure that you've tested every single line of code that you developed, including all the different conditions if you've got like if and else and so on. And we try and aim for 100% coverage. That's not always possible. What we also do, we run a code coverage. We use Covertura as part of our Jenkins build. And you can also configure your Jenkins build to fail if you're below a set percentage. So what I've got a Jenkins server with this project set up and running. And this is what it was like before I did the tool. So it's failing the 5 tests that were there, and the code coverage is pretty low. I mean, we could just like drill into a class and package and see what lines are being covered and so on. But what I'm going to do now, I'm going to commit the state of play of the code as it stands to Git. So that's going up to Git now. And then I can kick off a new Jenkins build. So it's pulling down the latest code from Git. And then it's doing a Maven build to sort of start doing all the tests and compiling everything. This is using Spring Boot, by the way, as well. If anybody's used Spring Boot? Cool.
One question.
It's just a really nice way of like getting a Spring web app up and running really quickly. So let's run all the tests, and because we've made all the tests pass, the build's successful. The test results have gone way up, and ironically, because we've probably been adding more lines of code, the coverage has been doing odd things, and also because we're not testing things like controllers. But if you look at the code, it'll also tell you what lines you haven't tested, because they'll have like the pink background, but if you have tested that line, you'll get the green background. So I mean, this is just like a way of like maintaining the code quality. And that's it. There's just the demo and everything things like is on GitHub. You can just pull it down and run it on Spring Boot. And then there's links to like JUnit, Cucumber, etc. And another workshop I did on Thymeleaf. And then if you want to use the TDD framework for Thymeleaf, there's a link to Connect to GitHub where we've got that in place, because that's an open source project that we did.